Good morning, everyone, and good morning to all of those who are tuning in through our live stream. I'm Robert Doar, the president of the American Enterprise Institute, and I don't often come to all of our events, but sometimes I come to important events or significant events or events that I'm particularly interested in or that I think deserve special attention. And this is one of them. We're here to talk about cities and severe mental illness, the challenges in New York City and Los Angeles, and we're being led in this discussion by our distinguished fellow, Sally Satel, who's been at AI for so many years and has done such outstanding work on very, very difficult challenges for our country and for our cities. I'm going to say a little word about Sally in a minute, but I did want to just say that I'm also particularly happy to have people who are coming from city government. Because I came from city government. Before I came to AI, I was the Commissioner of Social Services in New York City, and some of the, I was going to say characters or participants in our conversation today are old colleagues and friends and people that were in the same battle that we were in New York City during Mayor Bloomberg's term in helping people who were homeless on the street get into some form of care to address their underlying issues and to find housing. And those are hard challenges, and as anyone who's been around many of our cities in the last few years, there's challenges that we're not necessarily winning. And so we need to think anew and keep thinking and keep sharing ideas and perspectives that can allow us to help individuals who are struggling on our city streets. But the last and most important reason I'm here is to say just a word about Sally Satel. Sally, you know, is a doctor who actually provides care on a regular basis to people who are struggling with substance abuse. She is a writer of great eloquence, and her reputation is far and wide, and she's writing really outstanding things and has for years on these difficult issues. And I recommend just one of the more recent pieces she wrote for our publication, National Affairs, Opioids and Appalachia, which she wrote after spending some 12 or 18 months in Appalachia, not only observing what was going on there as a scholar, but providing care to people who were struggling with opioid addiction. So we have a real star in Sally Satel, someone who both walks the walk and talks the talk. And I'm very, very glad that you're hosting this event. And I wanted to come here personally to welcome my fellow New York, not New York, but city employees and New Yorkers to AEI and say how glad we're all you're here. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you.
Take care.
Well, thank you, Robert. That was incredibly generous. Well, speaking of walking the walk and talking the talk, here they are. So in November of 2022, the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, called a press conference about people, New Yorkers who were doubly burdened with severe mental illness, which is usually psychotic illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar illness, and who were homeless. He said, for too long, there's been a gray area where policy, law, and accountability have not been clear, and this has allowed people in need to slip through the cracks. It can't continue. And so the mayor's office introduced an initiative to illuminate that gray area and light a path out so that these folks with severe mental illness whose symptoms were so grave that they actually impair their capacity to meet their basic needs may see a way to well-being. So what is the progress of that initiative so far? It's true, it's not even been around for a year, but there are still lessons to learn at the very least about how one embarks on such a, I want to say that progressive, but I mean that in the best sense of the word, initiative. I see this progressive. I see it as an important form of benign paternalism. So we're going to cover a lot today, starting with the backdrop of the problem, the philosophy of it, the politics of getting a city's measure up and going in New York, of course, but then later compare it with efforts in Los Angeles. What are the dynamics of outreach? Because so many of these folks, in fact, I think all of them, are really brought in from the street. And if they wanted to come in, they wouldn't need to be persuaded in the most artful way, and sometimes taken in by other methods, but for clearly their own best interest, and often to save their life. what's the role of the police? What are the practical hurdles to implementation, the nature of the controversy, and as I said, any early results so far, and what lessons might other cities who are contemplating such an initiative start to think about. So as I said earlier, no one could know more about this wrenching social and public health problem than the people on this panel, because they are truly serving on its front lines. So we'll start, you're not in the order I want you to go in. So it starts with Brian Stetton, who's Mayor Adams' senior advisor on severe mental illness and the main architect of the New York City measure. It's called a measure, it's not called a program. I mean, it has a name, really.
Series of measures.
Okay. And he was a former policy director at the Treatment Advocacy Center, which is here in Northern Virginia, and just in fact, its president, Lisa, is right here, Lisa Davis. It's a wonderful, very, very streamlined organization that helps the severely mentally ill, often through legal measures and state laws. Also, Brian Stetton was a former assistant New York State Attorney General. After him, Scott R. Water, who's the director of Bronx Works, which is a human services organization and settlement house. And it's the agency, and you've been there quite a while.
Yes.
Yeah. I think at least 20 years.
More
Okay.
35
Oh,
years.
he knows a lot, but and it's the agency that has the city's outreach contract for the Bronx, and he created the organization's homeless outreach team. Captain Stephen Espinoza was a member of the New York City Police Department's Emergency Service Unit. It says he's retired, but I think he's coming out of retirement presently. And he was deeply involved with rescue efforts of all kind and very experienced in the management of people with severe mental illness. And finally, Pietro D'Angelo is a clinical and forensic psychologist with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, where he developed crisis intervention training, among many other initiatives. So we'll start with Brian, and then I think you heard your order, and then we'll do Q&A. Well, first I'll ask if any of you have questions for each other to, maybe draw out some more points, and then open it to you guys. So
Shall I come to the podium?
you don't have to, wherever you prefer.
I'll come to the podium.
Okay, yeah, and you guys figure wherever you'd rather.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much. It's such an honor to be here. So grateful to AEI for putting this forum together. And Sally, thank you as well for making the plug for the Treatment Advocacy Center. I'm very glad to have my friend and Executive Director Lisa Daly here. And so much of the philosophy, the underpinnings of the work we're doing in New York flows from the things that have been said and written by the great research psychiatrist Dr. Fuller Torrey, the founder of the Treatment Advocacy Center. And I am among his proud acolytes, and so many of the ideas I'm going to share with you today, I think it's fair to say, come from the work I've been privileged to do with Dr. Torrey over the years. So when the mayor announced the initiative, the culture shift that we are attempting in New York last November, fair to say there was a firestorm of controversy around it, just kind of a media backlash that arose immediately that was really rooted so much in kind of misinterpretation, people misconstruing a lot of what the mayor said. Some of that was predictable and predicted, not quite to the extent that we faced it, but of course it's incredibly frustrating when it's always fair game, of course, to be criticized for what you've actually proposed, but when people have taken it in all kinds of wild directions, it becomes kind of hard to cut through the noise and help folks understand exactly what you're doing. So even almost a year later, I'm grateful for opportunities like this to just kind of make a few things clear about what we actually proposed that day and what we've been implementing in the months since. This was portrayed in many of the media accounts as an attempt to sweep the streets of homeless people. And kind of warehouse them in hospitals, which is, of course, absurd, unconstitutional, and not something we would ever have any interest in, even if we had the legal authority to do it. This is an initiative that's focused on a small subset of people who are unsheltered and unhoused, and of course there are many other things we need to be doing to deal with that larger population, but this is very focused in a laser-like way on a particular, as I say, subset within that larger challenge and population. This was also kind of portrayed as something that was putting the police kind of on the front lines of solving this problem of rampant, untreated, severe mental illness. Undoubtedly, there is a role for police, as we'll talk about today, in solving this problem. They are very much our kind of eyes and ears on the ground. But I think there's universal understanding that having decisions about whether people should be taken to a hospital for treatment are always best when made by clinicians. And if you look at the details of our plan, you'll see that there are lots of things we're doing to maximize the opportunities to have clinical decisions being made rather than putting law enforcement in that position wherever possible. At the same time, recognizing that there's an inevitable role for law enforcement and we want them to understand what the law is. This was also portrayed as an effort for by us to expand the law, to give police and outreach workers new powers to make decisions to bring people out of a hospital, into a hospital for treatment. We have no authority to do that from City Hall. We don't make the law. This was simply about clarifying what the law has really been for a long time and was widely misunderstood. I'll get into more detail about that. But I think probably the part that offended me the most, I kind of took the most personally about the way this new policy was misunderstood, was the idea that this was the answer, right? That this was the administration's way of saying, here is the one and only thing we have to do to solve this very complex problem, which of course is the product of decades of systemic neglect and requires solutions on multiple fronts, many of which are simply about making investments in all kinds of resources we need to build a robust system of mental health care that provides services and supports for people at all levels of need. And that's not something we're going to accomplish overnight. That's not something we can accomplish purely through a culture shift. It's going to take time. I think in the months since, because we've been more specific about some of the things we're hoping to do on the resource front, there's a greater understanding that this is not the one thing we're relying on. But this particular plan was, we felt, an important place to start because it addresses the problem that we're facing at kind of the most root fundamental level, at the point at which we have to begin getting a handle on the fact that we have so much untreated mental illness kind of visible in the streets of New York City. And the problem kind of focusing on here as we kind of break down this larger issue into solvable chunks is the reality that you've got a lot of people who have to start with a period of hospital care if they are to have any hope of getting where we all want them, which is back out in the community, living their best lives in the least restrictive possible environment. And to get somebody who is in a state of untreated psychosis into a hospital, it's not just enough to get them to the door. You've also got to get them admitted and held in hospital care for long enough to actually heal. And that's not going to be a period of a couple of days or even a week or two where you're then discharging the person back to the street. We're really talking typically about someone who needs to be in a hospital for 3 to 4 months to get the meds right, learn some habits of treatment engagement, and get the process starting through the bureaucracy where we can actually discharge them to a supportive housing environment rather than to a shelter to give them that fighting chance. And getting people to a hospital, getting people to stay in a hospital is just fundamentally more difficult with psychiatric care than it is with any other type of medical care because of the reality that the illness often interferes with the person's ability to recognize what their own needs are. It's this phenomenon known as anosognosia we can talk about more later, right? It's a lack of insight. It's a corollary of the mental illness for many individuals. It's a neurological syndrome that makes it simply impossible for many of these individuals to recognize what their own needs are, no matter how painfully obvious it is to everyone around them. So to get around this, right, to actually make it possible to get people to the hospital when they are in that need and hang on to them long enough to treat them, we are reliant on the law, as in every state, right? We have a civil commitment law that allows us to take these actions when we find somebody is generally a danger to themselves or others as a result of their untreated mental illness. And the great problem that I observed in my kind of first months after coming up to New York to take this job and being out with outreach teams and being in hospitals and talking to folks who do this work every day, there was a widespread misunderstanding about the scope of that authority that we've had all along, right? There has often been a sense that in order to remove a person from a community setting when they are exhibiting mental illness symptoms and have a clear need for treatment, and you've made all efforts to get the person to come to the hospital voluntarily, and it's not happening, typically because of anosognosia, the belief was that the law did not allow us to take any action in that situation unless the person was violent or suicidal or acting out in some outrageously dangerous way, such as running into traffic, or if they had some medical need that made them an imminent danger to themselves or others. Then it was understood there was this authority. And all that, of course, is grounds for taking somebody to a hospital and admitting them and holding on to them there. But that also leaves out a huge swath of people who are in desperate need of care, and that is those who are dangerous to themselves by virtue of their inability to meet their basic human survival needs, such that they are gradually causing their own self-destruction. And it's not something that creates necessarily an imminent risk of harm, but when you encounter someone who, and they have to be exhibiting mental illness symptoms, let's make clear, we're not talking about everybody who you might encounter who's not meeting their basic needs, because in many cases that's going to be the result of addiction alone, and that's not something that can be addressed in a psychiatric hospital. But when the person is exhibiting mental illness symptoms, and they are filthy, or they have lice, or you can smell urine or feces on them, that may not create an imminent risk of harm to them, but that is absolutely a situation where a person is a danger to themselves. And so much of this culture shift that we've tried to bring about is focused on making that widely understood, not only by the folks who make these decisions to bring individuals off the street to a hospital for evaluation, and that's outreach workers and in many cases police officers. And to be clear, they don't have the authority to have that person admitted to the hospital, but they can get them to the hospital door. And then in the hospitals, we want that same understanding of the breadth of what it means to be a danger to oneself to be understood, so that we can make this happen and have it all go right. Just kind of shifting quickly, because I know we have a lot of people who want to speak today about how this is going. We have really focused initially on a very small subset of the people who could be described as kind of meeting these conditions. It's those who are most well known to our systems because they are on our top 50 lists. We maintain 2 lists where we bring together the various city agencies and contracted partners to talk about folks who we've identified as being particularly challenging to the system, people who are stuck in this revolving door, who are very well known to the system and are exhibiting mental illness on a regular basis and have been resistant to all efforts to make available to them the treatment and supports that we have. And whatever resource deficits we have, and I don't mean to minimize them, hasn't really been the issue with the folks who are on these particular lists. One that's focused on individuals who are known to the subway system, the other is focused on streets and people who congregate in parks. These individuals have been put to the top of the list for all the resources we have in terms of housing and mobile treatment teams, and they want no part of it. Not to cast any blame upon them. It's part of their illness not to understand their need for it. They reject and refuse these services again and again. By applying this broader sense of what it means to be a danger to oneself, at these meetings where we talk about these individuals weekly, we've managed to bring many more of them, and this is a good segue into your next speaker, Scott, who's actually doing this work with his organization, Bronx-Works, as one of our contractors. But we have managed to make remarkable transformations in a number of lives of people who are on these lists. Also working with the state, who've been a great partner to us in that they have made a number of state hospital beds available for this kind of 3 to 4 month treatment that it really takes to change this kind of a life. We are starting to see some really tremendous results where we're bringing people back into the community, into permanent supportive housing after having experienced this kind of hospital stay. And we're making differences in lives that just hadn't been possible before. Now, admittedly, this is on a small scale. This is something that is being felt, I think, by those who happen to be in the immediate environment of some of these folks who were on the street prior to this. But to the average New Yorker, they're still seeing plenty of people with untreated severe mental illness kind of around them. So we have a lot of work to do and a lot of resource needs to address to get to the point where we can really scale this up to where we're addressing this on a citywide basis. But in terms of establishing some proof of concept, the things we're doing with our top 50 list are exciting and tremendous. And I will I'll let my friend Scott tell you more about that. So thanks a lot.
I think I can just sit down and describe the situation. I don't need to go to the podium if that works. So again, my name is Scott Allwater. I am a social worker by training. I'm a licensed master social worker. I've actually been with Bronx Works for about 35 years. I'm not the executive director there. I'm an assistant executive director, and I also want to say my opinions are my opinions alone and not necessarily Bronx Works opinions. So just to say our experience with this, we've been providing homeless outreach in the Bronx 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for about 25 years. Recently, we've always had the city contract for outreach. Recently, we also got a state contract for outreach that really focuses more on short-term care. So we have both the city and the state contract for outreach. In addition to doing outreach, we run these things called safe havens, which are low threshold shelters. And they're really aimed at people who are really resistant to normal, regular shelters. Safe havens have very few rules, very few restrictions. You can more or less come and go as you please. Again, they're low threshold. And we have a couple of hundred beds in our safe haven programs. We have stabilization beds. They even have fewer restrictions than safe havens. We run a 200-bed mental health shelter for people with mental illness. It's a facility where there's usually about 15 people per room. It's in New York City. Unlike any other place in the country, there's an absolute right to shelter. The Bronx has a population of about 1.4 million people. At any given time, our outreach team is only following about 350 people. And I was recently in California, and I saw the number of people on the street in California, and compared to New York, it looks like you have far more people around the street. I think in New York, we have far more people who are actually in shelter facilities. So, just a context to what Brian is saying. For years and years and years, we've had the ability under the New York State mental health hygiene law to issue removal orders, which it's a form you fill out and you call the police department, you hand the police officer the form, and they have to transport the person to an emergency room. So we've had that ability for at least 15 years. In previous years, we were very reluctant to use that privilege. Even with people who were clearly in positions where they were dangerous to themselves or others, because what would happen is once they're transported to the hospital, there was very little communication with the hospital staff, and many times the hospital would discharge or not fail to admit them or discharge them very, very quickly with no coordination whatsoever. And that would make it even more difficult to, the client would be angry with us and even more service resistant than what they were, before we issued the removal order. So what's actually changed, over the last 9 months, since Brian has been at the helm there, is now when we issue a removal order for somebody, they really stick. And there's been significant bureaucratic changes to make sure that the person, once they are at the hospital, that they are properly assessed and admitted, when necessary. And another thing that takes place is, and thus far, since December, I think we've issued about 16 removal orders. Out of those 16 removal orders, already 4 people have moved into their own apartments. They've gotten the services they need, so that's almost a quarter of the population, and they're on their own. They're on their own with supports. they're not just in an apartment. They have ACT teams. They have special mental health services. They have people who are following up with them. But thus far, about a quarter have already transitioned into permanent supportive housing. We have another 3 or 4 people who their disability is so severe, even though they've been in the hospital for a lengthy period of time at this point, and there's different medication regimes. It looks like they're not going to ever be able to transition into their own apartments. And we have one person we know is in a nursing home. It's an actually very interesting case. This individual is, we believe he has Huntington's disease. He trained as a physician in the Dominican Republic. He comes from a well-educated family. He's well-educated himself. And he ended up on the street in really, serious deprived state. And we have a couple of other people, again, people who've been on the street. In one case, one of the clients that I'm thinking of, she was on the street for like 30 years. And she is not somebody who's been able to recover enough and to be able to cooperate with a permanent plan where she's off the street for good. So I think Brian also, and I want to reiterate another thing that Brian said, is that this isn't everybody that's homeless. I mean, this is a small subset of people. This doesn't, this involuntary transport to a hospital, involuntary admission is 16 people in a borough that has 1.4 million people. It's a small subset. But these are, a lot of times, folks that are the most visible to the public, that you see over and over and over again for years and years and years. And we're to the point now where our most chronically homeless people and the folks that we believed had the most serious impairment, are more or less off the street now and either in a hospital or, again, 4 transitioned into their own apartments. We have other people that are in transitional housing that are moving towards their own apartments. We feel like the situation for them for this subset is much, much more positive than ever before. I would also like to say another thing. There are a lot of people with very serious mental illness that are living in shelter programs in New York. And they're not street homeless people. But I've said this to Brian many, many times, there's a need to create a top 50 list for that population as well. And where they're really tracked and where there's an ability to get to them to the hospital. When I think back over time, with people who we've worked with who've been our clients that have ended up doing the most, been in the front page of the newspaper for pushing somebody off a subway platform, for example, they haven't necessarily been the street population. They've been people who've been housed in shelters. And we do have a number of people, probably about 10% of the folks that are in our mental health shelter that we really worry about, being able to meet their own needs, or also people who really pose a danger. So, thank you.
Can you back up a little bit? Thank you. And walk through just walk through a situation, a real one.
Okay.
A person's, how did someone even become called to your attention? How does a process get kicked off? And every little step, I think that would really be helpful.
So for one thing, again, our outreach programs, we have 45, 50 full-time staff people, including clinical staff. We have a number of licensed social workers that are a part of the team. We don't provide psychiatric services directly ourselves, but we have a psychiatrist embedded in our program from another organization, Janian in New York. So our outreach team, we're out there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we have a pretty good feeling on who's out on the street at any given time. And then there's certain periods of time where all of a sudden, things escalate, where our worry about somebody's welfare escalates. So, for example, I remember on Christmas Day, in New York, Christmas was really, really cold. We came across somebody who we've known for years, who was, in the Bronx, they have subway platforms that are exposed, that are outside. They're elevated platforms. So she's in the elements. I think it was like 10 degrees that night. Her feet were so severely swollen she could hardly walk. In fact, she was barefoot. And, we were like, look, we think you need to go to the hospital. She refused. She's another person with no insight into her mental illness. And, so a decision was made to have a clinician respond and do an assessment. She met criteria for involuntary removal. We filled out the removal order paperwork, and the police showed up, and she was transported to Jacobi Hospital. She didn't want to go, but she had to go to the hospital. And she was admitted. She was initially treated, and this is true for a lot of the people who have been subjected to involuntary removal. A lot of times they do have serious physical problems like infected legs, open ulcers. So initially, for the first couple of weeks, she was treated for her medical condition. And then from there, she was transferred to a state-run THU facility. What's THU stand for again, Brian?
Transition to housing unit.
Transition to housing unit. And she was in that unit for a couple of months, put on medications. She began to clear up. And she is one of the people who is now living in her own apartment. I remember I spoke to her sister when all this was happening at the point that we got her into the transitional housing unit. And her sister said, oh, she's been homeless she's in her early 60s for 30 plus years. She's a hopeless case, and so on and so forth. And we appreciate what you're doing for her, but this isn't going to work or whatever. And sure enough, I mean, she is off the street. We hope off the street permanently, and she's doing quite well from everything we know.
That's great. What do you do when we have time? What do you do when a person doesn't want to take medications? We could, if you'd rather, hand that over to Brian.
You know what? I
that's
think
fine.
Brian is the
Yeah.
expert on AOT. So
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so, and this is actually my roots in this type of policy, in this advocacy area, begin with my having been involved with creating New York's Assisted Outpatient Treatment Law, AOT law, in 1999. And the idea behind that is simply that people who are trapped in this revolving door that we've described often have great difficulty staying adherent to the medication that's prescribed to them.
Can you mention Kendra's law, the whole Kendra
yeah,
situation?
right. So,
I just want to put people faces as much as we can.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kendra Webdale was a young woman from upstate New York who was down in New York City, like so many people, kind of pursuing her career dreams, who was pushed into the path of an oncoming train on January 3rd of 1999 by a young man about her own age by the name of Andrew Goldstein, who was someone with schizophrenia who had been very much meeting this profile that we've described, someone who was trapped in the revolving door of the New York City public mental health system, who had been hospitalized multiple times, who lots of people had worked with and tried to help. And many of those folks were not shocked to open the paper and see his face as someone who had committed this horrific act. And look, there were moments in Andrew Goldstein's journey where he actually was asking for treatment. More than once he came into a hospital and said, I'd like to be admitted. So I don't want to overly simplify the situation there. But the reality is, upon discharge from hospital, again and again, he was given a prescription and a pat on the back and connected to an outpatient provider and encouraged to go visit them and take the medication. And he would disengage from that. And this is a very common pattern. And it has a lot to do with the reality that people with mental illness, especially when things are going well, often have a tendency to say, hey, things are going great, I don't actually need these meds, I don't really have this illness, and stop taking it. So the idea of AOT, Kendra's law, is to create a legal framework where we can monitor and continue to pay attention to folks upon their discharge from the hospital by having them under a court order. And it's a mutual court order, right? The person has been presented with a treatment plan that has been approved by the court and incorporated into the order, such that there's now this mutual commitment where the system is expected to deliver a set of services that the court has approved to the person, and the person is expected to stay adherent to them. And in the situation where that's not happening, where the person fails, it's not that there is some punishment where the person is held in contempt of court at that point, but we have an opportunity to bring that person back to the hospital to see how they're doing because they violated the court order. We don't have to wait for them to act out in some dramatic way to establish that they're dangerous to themselves or others. The fact that they've stopped taking the medication is basis enough for us to have some concern if we don't know how they're doing at that moment. So that's the concept behind New York's Kendra's Law. Many states have similar programs. At TAC, I was involved in helping set them up around the country. And it is an essential tool in the toolbox for making sure that folks who meet this profile get the care and attention they need when they're not hospitalized.
Right. And if I can ask did you want to add to that?
No.
Oh, one more question.
May I add? I know I'm out of order.
Oh, is this part of your talk?
It's
Or you
well,
did-
it's part of
Go for
Kendra's.
it.
So back in 2015, I worked for the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, and I was the psychologist that was part of the initiating team of AOT for LA County. And I cannot say enough about the beauty of AOT. And as you're saying, the one thing I want to say is think of everything on a continuum. And on the far so on the one end of the continuum, you have standard freedom, if you will, as a citizen society. And then on the far end, with someone with a severe mental illness, you might be looking at what we call an LA County conservatorship. And a conservatorship is when LPS conservatorship, and that's when, as an individual, because of the impairment caused by a severe mental illness, you're having difficulty surviving in the community, and you're deemed gravely disabled. Gravely disabled meaning you can't provide for your food, shelter, and clothing, and so forth. So we have standard freedom on one end. We have conservatorship on the one other end. There has been a gap that AOT filled that's along that continuum. That's very, very important. To the naked eye, you won't see it. If you do this line of work, it was a major gap that indeed has a wonderful place.
For sure.
Thanks. And we're going to return to the order I set out at first, but I did have just one more question for you. Again, in this trajectory, when this woman was admitted to the hospital, and she stayed, I'm sure, for quite a while. Just one of the most unheard of things about this program is it's a wonderful article in the New York Times in June about, it followed a few people, including this doctor that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And I think they used their full names. I mean, they gave permission. And one person stayed 104 days. I don't know if that's a maximum, but that is a solid amount of time, much more than the week one often gets at most. But let's say you're in the midst of your 104, what is going to become your 104 days, but you don't want to take the medication. That's really what I meant. But I'm glad you mentioned the AOT.
Sure.
No. I'm glad you mentioned the AOT too.
Yeah, so I would say that a person's lack of readiness to stay adherent to treatment in the community would be grounds to hang on to them in the hospital. There's nothing magical about that number. It's actually 120 days that we typically try to keep people in this state-run unit, the THU. We have a couple of similar units within our city mental health system as well. But if you get to the point where you've hit 120 days and you're reassessing that person's needs and it's clear that they are not ready to stay engaged with treatment in the community because their lack of insight does not equip them in that way, that's a person that needs to remain in the hospital for a longer period of time.
But I mean, do you do forced medication ever in the hospital? That was my
So in a hospital setting, medication for therapeutic purposes can be administered over a person's objection. It requires a finding that the person lacks capacity to make a treatment decision. We have what's called a Rivers hearing in New York. So yes, there is a process for that. In an emergency basis, if you need to subdue a person who's presenting an immediate threat, you don't need that court order. There's always authority to medicate in that situation.
Yeah, and to be clear, we have, out of our small group of 16 people, thus far we have a couple of people who are in that category. Even though they've been in the hospital for a lengthy period of time at this point, they haven't progressed to the point where they can live independently.
Okay. Thank you. Captain?
Sure. Hi, good morning. My name is Steve Espinoza. I'm a retired captain with the New York City Police Department. I retired out of the Emergency Service Unit, which was the agency unit responsible for involuntary removals. We were the SWAT/rescue team, so I'm sure the panel's familiar with emergency service. I'm going to kind of bounce my comments off comments you guys already made. I know, Brian, when this hit the paper, there was a big outcry. And I think the belief was that the police are going to be giving new abilities to, like you said, kidnap people off the street as a stopgap against what was at the time some pretty horrific cases of subway pushes, some stabbings. And I think in the police department, we realized this was not the case at all. We realized we're the forward face of this in some sense, but we're there mostly to provide security. And the law itself, the law as it existed wasn't changed. None of our policy changed. The state commissioner provided a memo that kind of clarified what 941 and 958 were, and provided actually some excellent case law in there that kind of even reminded me of what was allowable at the time. I think people forget, though, that the police department was allowed during a cold weather emergency, as dictated by the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. We could approach a homeless person in the street. If they were refusing shelter at that point, we would invoke our EDP procedure, which meant we would decide if the person is a threat to themselves. In this case, kind of similar to your story of the woman on the elevated subway panel, at that point, we would be able to take that person to a hospital facility for treatment. Now, granted, as you said, we get them to the door. What happens after that is essentially out of the police department's hands. So we are where the rubber meets the road, but there's limits to what we can provide after. Let me preface my next comment. I am retired, so I'm no longer bound by the agency, but I will try and reflect the best I can. This is my opinion. I think one of the issues that comes with police is there's a lot of effort that goes into taking someone in crisis into custody. We ask our officers to approach a person with a knife. We ask them to climb a bridge to bring them down. That's a high level of police service provided to a specific person. The post-custody care should at least match that level of care. I don't know that it did. I'm hoping this process will change that, because we asked our cops to place themselves in substantial physical risk of civil liability to take these people safely into custody, and we do it in an overwhelming number of cases. I think 75% of cases are voluntary, so that means when officers encounter someone in crisis, they're able to talk them into custody, into voluntary compliance, which is always our goal. About a quarter of the cases is when we take them involuntarily. Sometimes we have to use coercive force. There's no way around it. Like, you have to force medication on some people sometimes. It's an ugly word, coercion, but it's true. We have to force people into care to help them and help society. But we do have to balance the safety of the public who is going about their day, taking the train, transportation. We have to balance the rights of the people who just happen to not have a home and are sick. In my mind, these are basically medical calls. These are sick people. We should treat them as sick people. But we do have to, at times, get them to the care they need against their will. Like you were saying, to go back to what you said that there's an issue with getting people care. Like, how can we ensure that when we expend this effort and time and resources, how do we ensure that this isn't a repeat customer? Because one of the difficulties police will encounter is to get someone to come with you voluntarily, you kind of have to make promises. You can't lie, but you do have to make them a promise. Are you going to get care? I'm going to deliver you to care, yes. If that person is out in 3 days and has another episode, what am I going to tell that person to convince them to come with me again? Because I've often heard when someone's barricaded behind a door, you told me last time you're going to get me help. You didn't help me. And by the nature of the structure of policing, more than likely the cops that respond to a certain person in crisis is going to be the same cops. So, like, I remember you, Brian. You promised me you were going to get me help. What are you going to do now? Yeah. And that really removes an advantage that cops have to make a dialogue with people. When you're dealing with someone in crisis, lying is probably one of the worst things you can do, because you've destroyed that relationship for the rest of your and their life. But what do you do when you've promised to give them help, or you've committed to give? I don't want to say promise. You've committed to giving them help, and they don't get that help. You're going to have a really hard time making that go smooth the next time. And my honest belief is, with repeated encounters, all we're doing is increasing the risk of a bad outcome. So I think the measure, you call it a measure, is a step in the right direction towards reducing the number of times police have to interact with people, because that's always better. It's always better for it not to be cops. In that sense, just reaching back to some of my colleagues, there is some training that needs to be done to make sure the cops are up to speed. Yeah. There were a couple incidents, I think, of cops meeting 958 clinicians and thinking that they have the authority, but we're working on that. So I think once the process goes on a bit more, I think everybody has is steering in the right direction, thankfully. So
for sure.
And I want to thank Dr. Satel for bringing this panel together. Even the 10 minutes we had outside in the hallway just chatting with each other, is building relationships towards, kind of working on this problem together.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you this. Thank you. I'm going to ask you kind of the same question I did, which is, could you give kind of a little case study, a case vignette of, a situation in which the police were involved, like with real details?
Sure.
Thanks.
The EDPs, emotionally disturbed persons, are emergency services bread and butter. It's the task we're specifically equipped, trained, and trained to handle. If you see us at a job, we're going to have vests, helmets, rifles, tasers. All of this equipment is defensive in nature. It looks offensive, but it's defensive. It allows us to absorb force without necessarily having to return it. An incident I can mention that specifically involves this, I don't know if you remember this from the Bronx. About, I think 2 years ago, there was a person in crisis behind a door, arguing with cops. Police officers were on the door, holding up a ballistic shield. During this event, the person inside fires the gun twice at the officers. The shield absorbs both rounds. You would imagine in that case, like, wow, like the person has shot at cops. Like, this is going to end badly for that person. In fact, the opposite happened. Officers continued the dialogue, trying to get this guy to come out. So in that sense, this is what the police do for people in crisis. Like we equip ourselves to absorb force, to minimize the necessity to deliver force. And in that case, it wound up the person tried to jump out the window. We caught him on the fire escape after he set fire to his apartment. But that's the nature of these crisis events. But again, to echo my prior point, I have had episodes with people who we've delivered to the hospital, and we'll take their medication for a bit after they've either forgotten or refuse to take because they don't like the side effects of whatever it is, whatever the medication is. They will stop taking it and return to crisis, and we're back on that door. And it's tough. It's tough to deal with people multiple times because they know us and they know our tricks, our tactics. They know what we're going to do. Like, oh, you guys are tying the door off now. You guys are breaking the peephole now. Like, you're not going to get me this time. It's an interesting situation because the police would rather have this person get effective care the first time we have to basically kidnap them.
Yeah. Are they specially trained? I know that a lot of cities have a special unit of police to perform de-escalations
Yeah, there are officers trained in CIT.
Yeah.
The unit ESU itself,
CIT, crisis
interventions
intervention.
training. 88% of the department is trained in CIT right now. The field officers are equipped with some basic defensive tools, plastic shields to defend themselves from edge weapons. It's non-ballistic though. Officers also carry a rope that allows them to tie off a door to kind of maintain someone inside an apartment so that they won't suddenly animate and cause some kind of further damage. The emergency service unit itself is, in their training, does a couple weeks of EPT training, emergency psychological technician training. So they're pretty adept at being able to kind of filter through a person's conversation to build that relationship and get them to ultimately give voluntary compliance.
And these are not plain clothes. I mean,
No,
I know
emergency
some
services-
places have. Well, yeah, I know Pietro is going to talk all about that, right? No, I interrupted. I'm sorry.
No, it's uniform. There is a smaller homeless outreach unit which deals with the persistent chronic top people, but far and wide, like the homeless interaction tends to be with regular patrol officers.
And most aren't violent, though, right, Scott?
Right.
Yeah.
Most are
It's
not violent.
important to say.
Yes.
Most of the people who we've ended up issuing removal orders for are because they're dangerous to themselves.
Yeah.
For failing to seek medical treatment or, for failing to come in and seek warmth during the coldest days of the year. Yeah.
Which is what our culture shift is really about, right? There was never controversy that people who are actively violent are EDPs and are in need of transport to the hospital if they don't wind up arrested. But it's those folks who are not violent who we're often walking away from. Can I also comment just real quickly on something Stephen said? Thank you. Because I think you made such an important point. It really puts your finger on one of the big issues we are trying to address, which is the demoralization that occurs, not just for police, when you go through the effort of bringing somebody to the hospital who really needs to be there a while, only to see them streeted within days or sometimes even hours. And it's not just for cops, right? I mean, it's something that I know the Scott's teams experience as well. And it becomes a question of, well, did we even make the situation better? Maybe we made it worse. And it has an impact of making folks less likely to do that again in the future. And that's obviously something we are very committed to getting our hands around as far as solving this larger problem goes. And we're fortunate that we have a city-operated hospital system in New York. A lot of cities have kind of moved away from having their own public hospital networks, but we have our Health and Hospitals Corporation operating 11 hospitals around the city, and they are receiving the bulk of this traffic. Most of these folks who come in on these removals do wind up in H&H hospitals. And because that is a part of city government, it gives us an opportunity to really make them partners. And H&H has been an incredible partner in trying to institute this culture shift. They participate in these meetings, these top 50 meetings we have through this coordinated behavioral health task force we have. So they're at the table with us talking about the folks who we're trying to bring these efforts to bear for. And when we get them to the hospital, because we have H&H there and they know the person is coming, we are able to work with them to make sure that that ball isn't dropped. And that has a lot to do with why we have successfully held on to people either in H&H hospitals or transitioned them from H&H to those state hospital beds we've talked about.
Yeah. Yes,
May
it's
I
your
add
turn.
something? Okay, thank you. So going back to that continuum. So we have standard freedoms that all of us have and are enjoying right now. And then, however, if we were to develop a psychiatric condition that starts impairing our ability to function in society, then we're going to have more difficulties, right? And so along the way, I may go for voluntary assistance like many people do and many people benefit from, right? And then we start getting into the area where now I come to the attention of people, right? So a couple of good examples. So we could have a high utilizer of emergency services, right? Because they're constantly calling 911 or they're asking for help, but yet as soon as the crisis is over, because they can't be mandated, now they fall into crisis again. So we could have that kind of reason why someone comes to the attention of like 911. And then we could also have the person that actually is a danger to others, that because when they deteriorate, now we need to send crisis help. So that's the part that we need to map a little better on our continuum. Because although there are some specific services that will respond to these unique types of cases, I know that at least in LA, we have some services that allow for that. But I think for the most part, the high utilizers and the high risk people who are coming to light because of their impairment from a mental illness, the standard case management is not necessarily effective, and the standard psychiatric hospitalization is not necessarily effective. So what's in between? And that's something we need to continue working on. May I use the podium?
Yes. Oh, I see. Okay,
Yeah,
of course.
because I need to use my hands. And,
All right, good job.
All right, so good morning. Piero D'Angelo, so I'm a psychologist from LA. Currently my employer is Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, but I'm not here representing them because I will tell you for about 10 years I worked as a community psychologist for the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health. And so I was paired with either a police officer from LAPD or an LA County Sheriff's deputy, and we would respond around the city or the county responding to psychiatric crises. And then I am also a police psychologist, so I get to see from that angle. And then also on the side, I do court-appointed evaluations for LA Superior Court, where 99.99% of the appointments are from public defenders and trying to see if a person is eligible for mental health diversion and so forth. I think what we're talking about unilaterally here is the concept of prevention before punishment. Prevention before punishment. Well, prevention of what? Well, prevention of someone's deterioration, right? Primarily mental deterioration. Prevention of a crime. Prevention of a victim. Prevention of law enforcement having to use heavy force on someone. All right, so that's on the prevention side. What are we talking about punishment? Well, we're talking about punishment of potentially a victim being punished for whatever reason, then punishing the individual who committed the act. And then maybe even coming out and punishing individuals who, along the way, were deemed to have acted inappropriately and trying to help the person as well. So there's a lot we can talk about here. I'll share with you something just in hearing everything that's being shared, and thank you, Dr. Satel, thank you, AI, for this wonderful opportunity to come from LA. And what we know in LA is that on average, about 5 people die in the streets every day. LA County. You can look it up. I'm going to guess that's a deflated amount. So about 5 people die. So our journey started about, I'd like to tell a couple stories that run parallels. So about 10 years ago and about 6 years ago, our journey started. In 2015, now switching about LA County Sheriffs, the El Nino weather storm was approaching LA. Much water and flooding was anticipated, and so it was expected that our waterways were going to be overtaken by rising water levels and deadly water levels. So as was mentioned by Scott, we do have a lot of visibly homeless people, and historically there's been a lot of homeless people inside the waterways, our dry river beds. So a colleague of mine, Jeff Diedrich, who if you'd want to clone a cop, you'd want to clone Jeff Diedrich. He was involved in responding to this. He was told, hey, we have these massive floods coming, go clear the waterways. Well, there were about 800 to 900 people living in these waterways, homeless individuals. So as part of his efforts, then he got together the existing homeless outreach services deputies with the LA County Sheriffs, and they started going out and talking to people. Well, the good news out of that is that no lives were lost when the floods came. The floods were not nearly as bad as they were anticipated, but indeed those waterways were overtaken by water and nothing. So that was the genesis of Jeffrey Diedrich and his role with the Homeless Outreach Services team, okay? Fast forward about 8 years now, and his Homeless Outreach Services team utilizes about 26 deputies. And by some standards, some would say it's one of the more complex and effective law enforcement agencies that involves sworn members and as part of the homeless outreach. In about 70,000 contacts with individuals experiencing homelessness, his deputies have never used force, they've never arrested anybody, but yet they do a phenomenal job at encouraging people to accept services. I'll go straight to what I'm going to anticipate Dr. Satel's question. Can you give us an example? So here's an example. So the Homeless Outreach Services team deputies, the host deputies, are involved daily in collaborative efforts. And so they'll team up with the outreach workers, they'll team up with different individuals who are there to help. So for example, they have the days where they provide mobile showers to areas that are populated with individuals living in homelessness. So one example, this one fella was very rude towards an outreach worker. Okay, hey, are you interested? No, get away from me, using profanity, using intensity, being very angry. This went on for some time. So he's a male fella who experiencing homelessness. The outreach worker was female. So she was very discouraged by his strong responses. And so then the shower project comes around. People invited, hey, come into the parking lot out of the dry river bed. We have showers, we have other services. This young man comes out of the dry river bed into the showers up, comes out, and then he goes to that outreach worker and he says, tell me more about what you have to offer. What was later determined, because they asked him, hey, well, what happened? What happened? At first you were cursing her, and he said, you know what, and I won't use his language, but I smelled really, really badly. Why would I want to talk to anybody? I mean, that was not an anticipated response to the shower project. But here this person who hadn't bathed forever feels more self-respected and more confident, and I'm able to talk civilly with somebody. I'll give you another example that touches on, has anyone ever dealt with situations where you have multiple jurisdictions that now start sort of interfering with each other, and it's their issue, it's their issue, it's their issue, and then we have paralysis. So there was a piece of land where there was an encampment, and this piece of land touched everybody's land. The federal land, the state land, the county land, the utilities, private land, everybody's land. And so everybody's looking at each other. Officially, nothing could be done. They just hadn't figured it out. So it was these 4 or 5 gentlemen who had been outreached by these deputies over the course of time. So having developed rapport and some sort of alliance, it became apparent that the massive trash, they literally filled, I believe it was 30-something large bins, not the trash bins, the ones that are hauled by trucks. I don't know what they're called or what their capacity is, what their volume is. Literally 30-something bins were filled by these individuals who were asked, would you mind cleaning up the stuff that you guys did here? It was about a $2 million project that cost very little, just the bins, because they cleaned themselves. They equipped these individuals with polo shirts, so they gave them a uniform, right? So it's that sense of community and a sense of respect, and it's prevention before punishment, right? We're preventing the escalation of a situation. By the way, in our program, so I'm a CIT instructor now for LA County Sheriffs. We don't like using the term de-escalation because de-escalation is misunderstood, and de-escalation should be mentioned as frequently as escalation. It's a little confusing. I would need about a 30, 40-minute talk to explain to you guys. What we refer to instead as crisis stabilization. So when our folks are going out there, they're preventing escalation, they're maximizing de-escalation, and the umbrella term over that is crisis stabilization. Because if you're just looking at one, you're going to potentially overlook the other one. And we think that in law enforcement, that's been a sort of a minefield that we've created for our folks, sending them out there by just talking about de-escalation. When people say, well, when I say de-escalation, I mean escalation as well. Well, when you say exhale, do you mean inhale? No, when you say exhale, that's a specific function. And then when you say inhale, that's a specific function. And those two comprise breathing. Same thing with crisis stabilization. Crisis stabilization is a relationship between escalation and de-escalation. Anyways, moving forward. So I want to share with you something else. In 2017, because of our dire situation of people living in homelessness in LA County, there was a delegation that went to Trieste, Italy. Trieste, Italy. Okay, so Trieste, Italy is the mecca for community mental health functioning. Okay, recognized by the World Health Organization, United Nations, and so forth. So we went there to learn, hey, what's this Trieste place about? And how can we adopt their practices and bring them back to LA, because we need help. So we went there as a mental health delegation. That started the process with Trieste teaching us about how we could do things differently with mental health. Well, in doing so, again, being a psychologist, having worked in community mental health, but also a law enforcement psychologist, the question came up, could the principles of Trieste, mental health, in applying to mental health practices also have relevance to law enforcement? So we've been in the process of adopting the principles of Trieste mental health to law enforcement. And what it comes down to, and this is going to get a little foggy, is the essence of human rights. So we've been working on that. And so then the now retired former director of Trieste Mental Health, Roberto Mezzina, M-E-Z-Z-I-N-A, came out to LA County to advise on the mental health aspect. And then we said, Dr. Mezzina, would you advise on the law enforcement aspect? Okay. So I can proudly say Roberto Mezzina, psychiatrist, is a mentor, and he's been guiding us. So we had him come out and take a look at our homeless outreach services team deputies. What do you think of these guys? Shadow them, follow them. What do you think? So Dr. Mezzina goes into dry riverbeds with them. And so then he said, you know what? I believe this is an example of human rights being practiced by law enforcement. We're like, yay. So One last piece. When Captain Diedrich, who oversees the Homeless Outreach Services team, talks about his deputies, he says that the training has been pivotal. And the training that we provide is based on the concept of ROAR, which is a field response model we developed, ROAR, a field response model that we developed that has provided that paradigm shift for the deputies on how they engage individuals. They're still cops, but they go out there. Again, many people have heard of the distinction between the warrior versus the guardian law enforcement perspective. So the warrior being more of the traditional force-based response, the guardian being more communication-based. So Captain Diedrich realized that if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, many of us may remember, if you look at the second stage or level with safety and security, properly trained law enforcement officers have a place within homeless outreach in providing that safety and security. And with enhanced training, such as ROAR, we believe that is a good match. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so
Thank
much. So I'll ask you one question, and then we have 20 minutes for questions from other folks. Do you think what's going on in New York could possibly happen in LA, or should it?
The latest stuff from Los Angeles is Pathway Home. So the LA County, LA County has secured a vast number of both private and public. So the LA County has bought a number of hotels and motels, and they are also accessing rooms in private establishments, hotels and motels. So right now, in the past, they would be like, hey, would you like a place to go live? Yes, okay, we'll come back, and maybe in the next couple of days, we'll find you something. My understanding is now that it's immediate. So that's for individuals who are desirous of services.
And what about for those who sometimes aren't, or a more organized way to approach the the basic needs population?
Yes. So would that be for a more symptomatic, a sicker group?
Well, the ones that, yes.
So
that can't take care of themselves. Right.
The Los Angeles County Department of Health does have a home team, homeless outreach, mental evaluation, and so they can, again, it's street psychiatry, it's multidisciplinary, and they do have their high-risk individuals, this number, mm-hmm. I don't know if it's top 50, but yes, they do pursue those individuals and encouraging them. There is AOT that's also utilized as another method of encouraging participation. So there's a lot of similarity.
Mm-hmm. Brian, do you know, Brian, do you know of any other cities that are contemplating a New York model?
We've had a number of cities that have been very interested and have been picking our brains and have asked us to tell them more about it, and have had meetings with us where we've described our efforts, and I think there are some things happening on that front. I don't want to jump ahead of what any city has announced, but I am optimistic that, especially as we start to come forward with more of the success that we've been having, and it's still early days for us, that it's going to become more of a national model.
Great, thanks. Folks, this gentleman? Oh, would you mind just saying if you're from an organization?
Is this thing on?
Yes.
Yeah, I have allergies, but Carl Polzer, and my professional work is advocating for the bottom 50%, but as a personal matter, I advocate for people with severe mental illness because of a family member who's been through all this. So we got him, he committed misdemeanors, and working with the courts, I got him, he was not competent to stand trial, so he went to a Virginia, one of our 12 mental hospitals, and we have better ones than I think most states. And there, this issue arose of information. And in the recent I'm going to back up. I'm playing off the institutionalization versus freedom thing. I think we're going to possibly be at the beginning of a sea change where we're going to reinstitutionalize a lot of folks. But as a result of my experience, I went to the federal data, and there is no data, hardly, none. In the National Mental Health Services Survey on the quality of care, on transitions of care, meds, whether they're first generation, second generation, you do get public versus private institutions that public ones have worse medications. And what I was particularly interested in was family access to visitation, because during COVID, I couldn't visit him. And then when he was paralyzed by an old medication that they gave him, which we wanted him medicated, we wanted him to get, we took away his civil rights as a family member working with the courts to get him treated. I called him up. They have a phone you can voluntarily come to, but they wouldn't tell me what's going on. After 2 days, he says, well, you know, I can bring him to the phone. So he's mumbling. So he got paralyzed. So I couldn't talk to him, couldn't visit him. Anyhow, my wife and I, over 2 years, we worked with 3 hospitals to start Zoom visiting. And then I got the legislature to pass a law because I wanted it to stay in place. But I went to this survey, and you can't find out, if we're going to reinstitutionalize all these people, we don't know anything about, we know more about what the people on the street from what I'm hearing from you guys. Anyhow, it's a long question, but I think, do we need to know more if we're going to be pushing, if you put them back in the hospitals, they push them right out. They're either going to go back in the street or to a mental hospital. We need to know what goes on in there. We need the eyes and ears of parents and family members and the government. We don't know. Maybe I'm stupid and I didn't find out the stuff. But I couldn't find out any data really about the quality of care.
Thank you.
If I would say one thing, I think lots of families, including my own, have been touched by having a family member with a really serious problem. You know, and one of the things that I think has been really important for the people who we're helping move along and who are moving out of psychiatric hospitals into their own apartments is involvement of family members. You know, and I think I think you make a good point. That is an absolute essential part of the puzzle, and there needs to be all kinds of systems put in place. I think most responsible hospitals, in our experience, will reach out to family members. They want to engage family members. I know things were different during COVID because of all the restrictions within the hospital settings. But one of the things that we've noticed with the people who've been able to move the furthest along, a lot of times there's been involvement of family members.
Well, what are the confusions around HIPAA? And unfortunately, I'm Health Information Protection.
Privacy and Accountability Act.
My sense is that clinicians in the emergency room and elsewhere, there's a lot of misconceptions about what kinds of information you can give to family members.
For sure. And one of the big challenges there is the failure to recognize that there's never a problem with clinicians receiving information from family members, right? Listening to the really important things family members have to tell them about what they know about their loved one's history with certain medications or proclivities when they're in the community. And so, to completely shut off communication, as so often happens, where you're not even able to receive information as a hospital clinician, I think is really tragic. But even with respect to providing information to families, which families are so desperate for, there are exceptions to the HIPAA rule that have actually been promulgated and explained pretty well by the Civil Rights Office of the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, where they make clear that if there is some reason to find that is in the best interest of the patient and the person is unable to recognize the importance of sharing information with their family, families actually can receive information from hospitals much more readily than is widely understood.
Okay. I hope that information is really getting out there. I know that's, did you want to add to that? No. Oh, okay. I think they saw, Carolyn?
Hi, Carolyn Gorman. I'm an adjunct fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Thank you so much to everyone for your time. And just to add to your point, sir, there are no timely or reliable measures produced by the federal statistical system on the seriously mentally ill population. So you didn't miss anything.
Thanks for answering that.
Yeah.
I forgot to.
We use a lot of phrases like falling through the cracks or revolving doors. I do data science work, so when I hear that that an individual is showing up now in one provider or agency's data and not the other. It's hard to hold agencies or providers accountable or reward them or make effective policy changes without knowing where an individual is going and how they're sort of making it through that track. So most people don't know, but agencies don't share data. Is the city doing anything towards that end to sort of thoughtfully share data across agencies and providers so that we can sort of prevent punishment and know where to make the effective policy changes?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's obviously immensely challenging because we are under constraints with HIPAA as well, right? Information that might seem like it might be useful to the police, for example, when responding to an EDP situation that might be in the possession of our hospital system really can't easily and readily be made available to police officers who may be looking in that database. So with great care, I would say we are making some efforts within our own systems, right? We have agencies that each kind of have their own tracking systems for many of the same individuals that all these systems are dealing with. Our Department of Homeless Services has its database. Our hospital system is part of a statewide hospital information database. Scott's organization as an outreach provider has access to some of that hospital information, and so I think we've come a long way in making hospital information available to outpatient providers. Yeah, there is a lot of discussion at this point. Nothing I can really announce today, but on kind of breaking down some of the barriers within these information systems that we maintain. You want to add anything to that?
I could just say in New York State, the Office of Mental Health has a database system called Psyches. And don't ask me what Psyche stands for. It's an acronym. It's based on Medicaid data. And everybody who touches the mental health system where there's Medicaid costs associated with it, they have a record in the Psyche system. So ordinarily, you can only access the Psyche system if you're a licensed professional. We're licensed professionals. We have access to the Psyche system. Ordinarily, if the client is not in a crisis, you need the client's permission or consent to be able to access the system, which I think is right and it's fair. There are certain circumstances, though. If the person on the street is in an emergency situation, we know their name, we can access the Psyche system, and it has how many hospitalizations, what the person's diagnosis is, what medications they were on. It even has their medical information. It's an invaluable tool for us. And when we issue a removal order, we don't do it in a vacuum. I mean, first of all, you only do it if there's no other alternative. And a lot of times before we go out there, we meet with our psychiatrist. We've done a preliminary evaluation of the person already. We've looked at their history. We've looked them up in the Psyche system, so we know what their diagnosis is. It's well coordinated, and a lot of thought is put into it, as is rightfully so if you're going to take away a person's civil liberties. I don't know whether California has anything similar to that.
Very similar. Very similar.
I'm sorry, might I ask a question, Brian? Is that system something that police agencies have requested access to, or don't even know exists?
You have to be a licensed clinician. You have to be a doctor, a nurse, licensed social worker in order to access it. That's a good question, I think, to ask Brian. Because again, I think in New York there's room for the outreach providers that have multidisciplinary teams. We all do at this point, and the police department to work better together around these types of situations. And again, another thing we do, our services don't stop once the person gets to the hospital. We have a social worker or case manager that goes out and visits the client while they're in the hospital. We're involved in the treatment plan. We're interacting with the family where we can, and we're involved in the housing plan from day one of the hospitalization. And I think that's why we're having success in getting people transitioned, back into the community.
Great. Howard? Oh, great. I'll get to all you guys.
I'm Howard Yusuf. I'm a fellow here at AI, but I live in New York. I'm Howard Husick. I'm a fellow here at AEI, but I live in New York. And as somebody whose grandkids ride the subway in Brooklyn, I'm really grateful for what Brian is doing. I write mainly about housing, but the term homelessness makes this whole issue very confusing. And housing advocates for more affordable housing invoke the specter of those on the street as part of their argument for more subsidized housing generally, and that seems to confuse the issue. But there is a program called Housing First, which is predicated on the idea that what the severely mentally ill, or anybody on the street, and that would include the severely mentally ill, really need is their own place to live, and self-recovery will ensue. There's a sobering article about Housing First in this week's issue of the New Yorker magazine, to which I draw your attention, about a new supportive housing facility in New York called 90 Sands, which is in the down under the Manhattan Bridge, Dumbo area. And it becomes very clear, even though the writer of the article seems to think Housing First is working, when you read the article, you have a lot of doubts. And that facility includes both subsidized housing, and it includes housing for those who were the mentally ill or substance abusing homeless. And it's clear that it includes the severely mentally ill, people who are having psychotic breaks that are described in that article. It also becomes clear that one can enter that facility without agreeing to a treatment plan. So I would love to know your views about Housing First as a philosophy and how it's implemented.
I'm going to step in and say, because I wrote this down, we're at the point where I'm taking the questions and I'll feed them to you so we can make sure we, end on time. I got it. That gentleman, just be brief, if you can.
Thank you. Leon Peace. I'm with the American Bar Association Commission on Homelessness. And not long ago, we visited the Skid Row area of Los Angeles. And as I recall, in that San Pedro area, 6th and San Pedro, on 6th Street, you have a certain level of homelessness. However, and if you go east to 5th, where a lot of the various shelters are, you have people living in relatively, they have tents, et cetera. However, if you go to 7th Street, the other direction, there it seems there's a great amount of destitution and a number of mentally ill, it seems there are more mental illness type situations there than in the entire other area of Los Angeles. I mean, to an astounding degree, a third world level. My question is, since then, we've been trying to get some relief for people there. What, from a policy perspective as well as in person, what do you think can be done from here in Washington, from a national policy and legal approach to relieve and address those conditions?
Thank you. I got that. That's obviously for you. Lisa? And then this gentleman over. Yeah.
Lisa Daly, I'm the Executive Director for Treatment Advocacy Center, former coworker of Brian. I actually was just kind of wondering, why do you think that the medical system doesn't feel obligation to serve this population? And if you live in a city that doesn't have city-operated hospitals, do you have any thoughts about how to engage the medical system to try to become more involved with this? Because I know this is an issue that we have experienced too, and we've tried to bring together panels of people. The medical teams are tough to engage. They don't necessarily want to be part of these conversations.
Thanks, Lisa. And that gentleman? And there's no, and someone back.
Regarding the politics in New York City, you mentioned, Stephen, I think that there was blowback initially to some of these initiatives. Has that blowback shifted to more, hey, this is actually working, or is it too early to tell? We have a very vocal, strident forces against certain ways of thinking about things that are a little bit off what people think are sensible. And I wanted to hear what you have to say about blowback, because I'm certainly used to blowback.
Thanks. That was my question. That was one of my questions too. And then one more. We'll probably go over a tiny bit.
I'm Caitlin Owens. I'm a reporter with Axios, and I'm just curious, like on a much bigger scale, about scope and scalability of some of the stuff you guys are talking about. And the healthcare system did come up. I mean, I don't know the numbers, but I know there's a shortage of mental health beds in this country. So with that in mind, yeah, like how scalable is any and all of this?
Okay. Well, we can go backwards and start with that. And
Sure.
yeah, just jump in if you. But I have a feeling a lot of these are going to fall to you.
Yeah, no, that last one is certainly the challenge I'm grappling with now as we start to see the success we're having with doing this on a small scale. I think probably the greatest challenge we're going to face in terms of scaling it up is just getting enough clinicians out there to actually make these kinds of determinations. We want to have this handled by clinicians more than police to the greatest extent possible. But in New York and really everywhere, there are just shortages of folks with these degrees who are interested in doing this kind of work. And I think for that reason, if we are going to scale it up to a larger level, we are going to be more reliant than perhaps we'd like in an ideal world on police to make decisions to bring people to the hospital door. Again, we're never going to have a situation where police can make a decision to have someone admitted to a hospital. But I think that's really why we have to lean in more to the notion of creating units within police departments of officers who really embrace this work and care deeply about the plight of folks who are having these kinds of psychiatric crises. I think it's really hard for the average police officer, and this is no knock at all, but the public safety mentality that's just kind of drilled into somebody doing that job day to day, where they are dealing with very real threats that are imminent to people's health and safety all the time, and to ask an officer who has that mindset, the typical cop on the beat, to blow half a day or more to wait for an ambulance to come and take somebody to a hospital who is not posing an imminent risk of harm to anyone, I think is tough. And so scaling it up through specialized units of police departments, I think, is key. As to the hospital bed piece of that, which I know is a big part of what you're asking, I think we kind of have to separate out what the needs are for hospital beds, because the number of hospital beds it takes to give people this kind of long-term care is really not that great. We're not talking about a huge number of people. So like in New York, we've been given 50 by the state, and we've opened a couple of 25-bed units within our H&H system. That's enabled us to make a pretty big dent in the need for that kind of 4-month care. We're not quite all the way there, but if we were to say double that, I think even in a city of 8 million, we'd probably hit the need for people who are in need of that kind of long-term extensive help. The greater need for hospital beds is more on the acute care side, right? People who really aren't coming from the street, who haven't experienced the ravages of homelessness, and really do need to be in a hospital for a couple of weeks. And that's where we've just bled beds. And I do think a huge part of solving that problem, if we ever do get there, is going to be some change on the federal level, right? We have a disastrous federal Medicaid policy called the IMD exclusion, where care for individuals for psychiatric purposes in dedicated psychiatric hospitals is not covered. This was something that was put in the Medicaid law in the 1960s to discourage the practice of operating large-scale psychiatric hospitals. And what that's done is it's shifted the burden for acute care, right, to general hospitals that have psychiatric units, because if most of your hospital is involved in something else, you can get Medicaid coverage for the psychiatric care you provide. But it's just so remarkably inefficient. We're never going to get to the number of acute care beds we need when we're relying on hospitals that are doing lots of things to fill that need, because the profit motive isn't there. These are hospitals who have lots of other kinds of patients to think about, and let's face it, hospitals make money performing medical procedures, and that's not what psych care is about. So to ever get to the point where we can have acute care provided in dedicated psych hospitals, which I think is the way to solve that problem, we're going to need some action from Congress.
And that would probably also go a ways to answering Lisa's question about that would get medicine more engaged if it was right in their, literally in their same venue.
Yep.
Quick question. I got whole one saved for you. This is easy. The blowback, has the public softened in terms of its attitude?
Yeah, the media coverage has shifted elsewhere. We'll leave it at that, based on what's going on in New York City.
I would say even more than that. I would think to the extent that press has been covering the issue, I think it's gotten fairer. I'm really happy to say.
And I think that was a result of there not being a dramatic shift in police operations. Granted, the police tend to absorb the bulk of the negative press.
Yeah.
And thankfully, the police have operated well, so that's so far so good.
Yeah, the martial law that had been predicted
It did not occur, right?
never happened.
Yeah.
And maybe there were some people who were upset about that because they were looking
give
forward
them
to
more
that.
ammunition,
So we're getting
as it
blowback from both sides. But yeah, I do think it has calmed down quite a bit. As I mentioned, I think in my original presentation, when we came out a couple of months later with our grander vision for how we build up a great mental health system and all the resources we at our Department of Health and Mental Hygiene are devoted to seeing come online in the next few years. I do think there has been a greater understanding that this is one piece of a larger puzzle and that it's focused on a limited population. So I'm encouraged.
Yep.
Yeah, I would echo what Brian said. I think there's a lot of people that just, quite frankly, don't understand what our outreach teams confront. And if you're going out and it's the coldest day of the year and you meet somebody in their 60s with such swollen feet that they can't even walk, who's floridly psychotic, I mean, how is it right or moral or ethical to leave that person because they don't want to go to the hospital? And that's what we see, and unfortunately, I think some of the critics, they're just unaware of these types of situations. I'm very proud of what our team does, and I think it's absolutely essential and necessary. It's we take great care to be careful and make sure people actually meet criteria. None of this stuff is flippant, and again, it's not going to solve. Course care for people with severe mental illness is not going to solve the homeless crisis in this country, which is very complicated, and it doesn't address the whole issue around substance abuse. But it is a piece of the puzzle. It's a significant and important piece of the puzzle.
Thank you. Okay, we have two more. I'm going to go tiny. You're going to get the last word, Pietro. So I don't know how many folks here read that article in the New Yorker this week. It was very long, and typical New Yorker style, extremely well written, and you could tell it was a product of enormous hours and a lot of human interest. But it certainly wasn't very analytical, I didn't think, and it really raised that question of what are the issues with housing first for folks who maybe are not quite ready.
If I could say full disclosure, we have a partnership with Breaking Ground, and we're actually the service provider in one of their buildings. And we've very much embraced the housing first model over the years. So our partnership with Breaking Ground goes back almost 15 years. The building that we're involved with them, I think we have 129 supportive units. So what I would say about housing first is it works for a lot of people. It works for the majority of people who are on the street, but it doesn't work for everybody. And there is a small percentage of the folks that get in, and it's hard to predict who they are, that just don't cope well, even when they get their own apartment. And you're right, services in the housing first model, they're not mandated. People can say, hey, look, we don't want your help, leave us alone, and we respect that decision. We always go back, we try over time to engage them the best we can. But again, I think it's really important to understand that it does work for an overwhelming number of people, but not necessarily everybody.
May I add something?
Sure.
I think the complexity and sophistication of the team that's working with a person is huge, because what if I've been out there 20 years and then I come indoors now and I miss the outdoors, or I miss my tent? Well, as a colleague of mine had happened to him with one of the people he was helping, put a tent in the living room. Right? I mean, that's part of adaptation. Or what if we do harm reduction? What if we start with, all right, how about you come in between, if this is an option, between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m., right? So that you're indoors, and we can work from there and expanding. So I think so much can be done depending on who is there to help, but placing someone, just giving them the keys, here you go, that's
And what a
That's a
great
lot to ask.
research project. I can't believe no one's working on this, or maybe they have, I should not say that. Or maybe they've come up with nothing as hard as they've tried to have some kind of predictive algorithm of, who's going to succeed. Do you know anyone who's attempted that? I don't know the literature that well on it.
There's been a lot of research over the effectiveness of housing first
It's a
in
little
general.
different.
And again, it's a model that's been proven to be highly effective. For the small percentage of people
Yeah,
where it doesn't really
challenging, yeah.
work well
Yeah.
for them, and how you pick them out and how you predict that ahead of time,
Interesting.
you're right, I don't
Okay,
know.
that's fine. Okay, and then that gentleman from the ABA, I think, wanted to solve poverty. I think that's what he was asking.
Let's do it. May I add another element to what you described? So there's even another issue that we're dealing with LA County right now, having relative to motorhomes or RVs, recreational vehicles. Take a look at that, because that's another huge. And so I know folks working on that right now, and it's going really well. The downtown LA piece, I don't have any. I mean, we can talk afterwards. And thank you for your interest and potential help. I'm assuming there's some there's an offer to help, so that would be wonderful. But right now, again, the homeless outreach services team with the sheriff's department is one of the elements in the RV/motorhome crisis. Which again, take a look at it. It's unique and it's very serious. But however, the attempt to diminish it is going very, very well. It's literally like 1 or 2 weeks old. This attempt to encourage people, because there's a bit of a nefarious side to it where it's strongly believed that somebody was actually furnishing broken down motorhomes as a site to live and charging rent. It gets a lot more nefarious than that.
Okay. Is there anything at the last minute you would like to add, Captain?
No, I just wanted to have people understand, like the police often are often the face of involuntary removals. We just need to understand that we are there to ultimately to provide safety to the providers, to the person in crisis, and to the general public. We are not the decision makers, as you said several times. We can get you to the hospital door, but we can't get you admitted. We, like everybody, the police, much like everybody else on the panel, is looking for that back end to kind of get shored up. I think the front end is pretty well oiled, but we kind of fail at the back end. And I think it's worth the effort we place in the front should be equal matched in the back.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much, and maybe we can come back in a year and a half, and when you have a lot more data, and have figured out how to predict who's, and and review this one more time.
I'd love that.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.